As you have noticed, we are running ahead of schedule, which must be, in this context, a direct influence of Saint Mardarија. Usually we are always late. But our next speaker, so let me draw your attention to the schedule. We will try to finish 4:45, and then we will proceed to the church where His Holiness Patriarch Irenei with other bishops will arrive. We'll serve a doxology and then continue with the Vespers and return back here into this hall for the dinner and then showing of the movie and the last keynote address by His Eminence Metropolitan Amphilochia. Our next presenter is Dr. Nicolás Ganson, who is a visiting assistant professor of history at Hellenic College in Brookline, Massachusetts, where he teaches world history, Byzantine history, and various topics in intellectual and religious history, including the history of religion in Russia. Dr. Ganson earned his BA in biology from the College of Holy Cross in 1998, an MA with distinction in history in 2000 from Boston College, and a PhD in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2006, where he specialized in modern Russia and the Soviet Union. Dr. Ganson's current research focuses on activities of Russian Orthodox dissident priests during the late Soviet period. His latest article is entitled Orthodox Dissidents as De-Atomization, Father Dmitry Dudko and his battle with Razovshenost. He may repeat this word later. Professor Ganson is also a graduate of the Pastoral School of the Diocese of Chicago and Mid-America of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, and choir director at Holy Epiphany Russian Orthodox Church in Boston, Massachusetts. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nicolás Ganson.
I'd like to thank, first of all, the organizers for inviting me to speak today, to speak on such a joyous, momentous, and holy occasion for all of Orthodox America. It's also an honor for me to be invited by the Serbian Orthodox Church because I have familial and personal ties with Serbia. Both of my grandfathers, both my paternal grandfather and my maternal grandfather, ended up studying in Belgrade at the University of Belgrade. One in the theology department and the other engineering, and they got there in different ways. And I won't say too much other than to say that my paternal grandfather served in the White Army as a young man who was in his early 20s, sent his wife and his son abroad, stayed to fight the Reds, and eventually made it to Kragujevac, and my grandfather's family lived there. And then And then he ended up in Belgrade studying. They were there until the end of World War II, where my father was born in Belgrade in 1932, lived through the war there. I grew up hearing his stories of being bombed by the Germans and by the Allies, and having to go to Pascha services in the morning rather than at midnight. And my other grandfather, who is from Brest, which is now Belarus, studied in Belgrade, studied theology in Belgrade on a scholarship from Patriarch Barnava. So I have those familial links. In addition to that, I have personal links because when we were in North Carolina, I'm native of Boston, but when I studied in North Carolina, we were kind of taken in, if you will, by St. Basil Parish in Kernersville near Greensboro, and came to really love that parish. And Father Dragan Zadic was like a true father to us, and a truly good, kind pastor whom we remember very, very fondly. We haven't seen him in a long time. So allow me, after that brief introduction, to turn to the topic of today. In today's talk, I have set the goal of, first, providing some insights into major intellectual and religious developments in late imperial Russia. Second, helping situate Saint Mardarија within the context of those developments. And third, reflecting on how his account of his life in Russia contributes to our understanding of those intellectual and religious trends in what we may call revolutionary Russia. I've limited myself to providing reflections and insights because a comprehensive treatment would take much longer than the short time we have here today. This exercise is not an end in itself. As we try to sort through the complex realities of the past, I hope we will learn a lesson or two. Before we begin our exploration, it would be helpful to have a basic understanding of the questions that have occupied historians of revolutionary Russia for nearly a century. First question, why in February of 1917 did the Russian monarchy fall? The overall tendency among Soviet and Western historians has been to see the fall of the monarchy as inevitable. Inevitable. Since, from the perspective of the Western mind, not only the West itself, but also those in Russia who adopted Western political and intellectual perspectives, the Russian monarchy was deemed backward, outdated, static, and not up to facing the challenges of modernity. Rare is the Western historian who challenges this point of view. A brief aside on the historiography. When I say historiography, my students' eyes pop out and they say, "What's that? What does that mean?" Historiography meaning just simply the historical literature on the topic of the revolution can really be divided into a relative handful. Can you hear me all right? Is that okay? Okay, too close. Okay, so. The historiography of the revolution can be divided into a relative handful of schools, if you will. And the two dominant schools of the revolution ultimately trace back to members of the provisional government, okay? So kind of westernizing, Western-minded politicians, sometimes, dare I say, opportunists. And a second school traces back to the Bolsheviks, ultimately. So if you look at political historians in the West, they owe their narrative largely to the narrative of the provisional government. And if you look at social historians who kind of took the upper hand over political historians in the 1960s and 1970s, and for the most part, kind of held sway since that time, started by really parroting what the Bolsheviks said. And in their defense, there wasn't much in terms of sources at the time that these things were being written. But that's nonetheless true, that kind of the two major branches of historiography ultimately trace back to either the perspective of the provisional government or the perspective of the Bolsheviks. Not to say that there aren't truths, if you will, to each of those perspectives, but That's how those two schools, if you will, or tendencies took shape. So from each of those perspectives, whether from the perspective of the provisional government or the perspective of the Bolsheviks, there was no need to really probe the fall of the monarchy because, from their perspective, it was doomed to fall. It simply could not have survived. It could not have adjusted. It could not have adapted. It couldn't have pursued any kinds of policies that would have allowed for the monarchy to survive. So for that reason, the February Revolution is really not studied very much. There's a relative handful of monographs in the Western world, in the English language, on the February Revolution. And one of them is actually by a Russian, by the last name of Katkov. So they don't really look at the February Revolution very much. As far as the Bolshevik Revolution, that's where they differ, because the provisional government and the school that kind of of political history that followed sees the Bolshevik Revolution as an inexplicable accident and disaster. How did that happen? You know, we didn't see that coming. And the Bolshevik perspective is, of course, that this was inevitable. This was a working class revolution, right? So that's where they differ. But on February, everyone kind of agrees, and therefore, I think the history of the February Revolution still needs some revision and further study. So that's the first question. Why, February? Why did the monarchy fall? Second, why did the Bolsheviks triumph? Were they truly popular? Was the October Revolution of 1917, when the Petrograd Soviet, headed by the Bolsheviks, seized power in the capital, a coup d'etat, or was it a popular revolution? For an abundance of reasons, the second question has been much more thoroughly examined. And like I said, there are kind of two tendencies, two schools there. I mean, it won't bore you, but there's kind of a post-revisionist perspective. This is kind of somewhat of a middle ground that has been reached in recent years. The two questions for our purposes today are of course related, because had there been no February 1917, there would not have been an October 1917, at least not an October of the same type. Furthermore, in many ways, October, that is the rise of the Bolsheviks, was a continuation of February, the fall of the monarchy. These revolutions were not entirely discrete or separate. In a sense, you could say October was born of February. Therefore, in probing the causes of the monarchy's fall, one will also find insights into the subsequent Bolshevik rise and Soviet seizure of power. Until recently, Russian religious historians have not really looked at the late imperial period very much. Again, Russian religious history during the late imperial period for a long time was much neglected. I'll tell you a little anecdote. About 15 years ago, as I sat in on a Russian history lecture, a student raised his hand and asked his experienced and accomplished professor what role the Orthodox Church played in Russia during the late 1800s and early 1900s. After a brief pause and a puzzled look, the professor answered that the Church played no significant role. Of course, it was no fault of the professors that Western historiography had collectively ignored the issue of religion. Though, having already taken a seminar at Brandeis University with the renowned Gregory Fries on Russian religious history, I was somewhat dismayed by the professor's answer. In general, this exchange, or what we may call this Q and no A, emphasized in my mind that religion did not much matter to Western historians. Fortunately, a growing number of historians has taken church history more seriously in recent years. In today's talk, we will encounter some of this recent scholarship on Russian religious history, which has helped provide a more complete understanding of revolutionary Russia, and some implicit suggestions about the relationship between intellectual and religious developments and the revolution. While some historians may view intellectual and religious history as entirely separate domains, I find them to be intricately linked, at least in pre-revolutionary Russia, as both lofty secular ideals and traditional religion informed the worldview of Russians on the eve of the revolution. The intellectuals and politicians, themselves guided by certain ideologies, sought to shape and guide the mentality of the masses, while the emergence of new ideologies also took on a life of its own, posing a clear challenge to older traditional ones. Before we consider the late imperial period in Russia, it would be helpful to reflect on the broader Western context and trajectory of intellectual development. Russia, though in some ways distinct from the West, was far from immune to the emerging Western ideologies of the mid to late 1800s. By October 1917, as we know, adherents of a mutation of one of these ideologies, Marxist socialism, took the political helm in Russia, inaugurating an era of Bolshevism. German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's oft-quoted statement, which I'm sure you've all heard, "God is dead," okay, God is dead, considered by many to have been a proclamation, was in fact an observation, spoken with no small degree of alarm and sadness. In his 1882 The Gay Science, he writes, "We have killed him. Yes, you and I, we murdered him. What comfort is there now for us? We, the worst of all murderers." So it was not a declaration of intellectual freedom, but a testimony of a tragic banishing of God from the universe. A universe without God was void of meaning and purposeless. In the words of intellectual historian Clifford Bachman, quote, "If there is no creator, all that exists is a random gathering of molecules. Beautiful, perhaps, but in the end, pointless and spiritually void. Worst of all, human life has no intrinsic value. I may be kind-hearted and charitable, or I may hoard material goods and smash the skulls of anyone I wish to harm. It makes no difference at all. The world will continue on its way, and all my actions, whether, quote, good or, quote, bad, will be forgotten," end quote. Since the dawn of civilization, religion formed the basis of culture the world over. Skeptics and rebels existed in every faith, but genuine unbelief appears to have been rare. From ancient Greece forward, virtually all major scientists held religious convictions. Even the most irreligious thinkers of the 1700s Enlightenment, like Voltaire, retained a belief in a divine creator. Then, during the 19th century, atheism emerged as an ideology against a backdrop of general secularization. Religious belief, practice, and institutions declined as new secular ideologies proliferated. From here we have not only atheism, but nihilism, anarchism, and socialism. Russian society, particularly its educated stratum, was far from immune from these developments. Following Russian writer Turgenev, the idealist and romantic fathers of the 1840s, the Westernizers and the Slavophiles gave way to nihilist and anarchist sons of the following generation. Soon after came populism, in Russian Narodnichestvo, Marxism and their fellow traveler, terrorism. We heard about the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. He was killed in 1881 by the People's Will, which was a populist party that aimed to ignite a powder keg of revolution with the murder of the Tsar. How did these ideologies emerge? Okay. How did these ideologies emerge and proliferate among the population? In Western Europe, a major factor was the migration of peasants to urban areas. The new urban workers worked long, grueling hours, which was hardly conducive to regular church attendance, and furthermore, many of them had little access to churches. Meanwhile, urban religious diversity, the championing of religious toleration as a civic virtue, and the developing market of ideas destabilized the religious worldviews of the newcomers in the cities. Finally, secularism emerged as an ideology that contested religion and implied a dichotomy between religion and science, forcing people to choose between biblical creation and Darwinian theories of evolution and natural selection. These same factors made inroads in Russia, but to what extent and to what effect? Saint Mardaria's memoirs, Incomprehensible Russia, and I'd like to take a moment to thank Dr. Groves for preparing that manuscript and for allowing it to be shared with me for research purposes. Incomprehensible Russia, the memoirs attest to industrial age problems facing what he called Holy Mother Moscow at the time of his arrival in Russia in 1907. And here I'm quoting directly. "The din of thousands of voices, shouts, and newsboys' cries, side by side with rich fur coats and skins more magnificent than you would see anywhere else in the world, went paupers in rags. Here with a haughty step walked merchants' wives, all dressed up. Beside them trudged other women, ragged and bent from poverty. Here gluttons, bursting with fat and swollen from sleep. There, pale alcoholic beggars whose thin legs would scarcely support their weight. On the corner stood grave, discouraged men. They would like to find work and couldn't. There in the archway of a house, a man disillusioned and lost took a gulp from a bottle of vodka. End quote. The contrast between the rich and the poor in the cities would intuitively provide fertile ground for the resentment which Saint Mardarија seemed to sense. Quote, in Russia, the aristocracy and the plain man, while speaking the same language, did not use it in the same way. The one could not understand the other. And this led to fear on the part of the common man, then to distrust, and then to enmity, end quote. This resentment could perhaps even lead to the class consciousness longed for by the Marxists. It's kind of an open question, but the argument has been made by certain social historians that indeed, yes, there was a working class identity that developed because of this, if you will, gap between the rich and the poor. It's an open question. It's something that could be fruitfully discussed. Yet seconds later, the bells of the 4040s rang out, calling people to Vespers. And suddenly the great river of humanity began to separate into little streams of people with bared heads floating into the wide open doors of this church and that. Consistent with the findings of recent scholarship, Orthodoxy allowed people to find unity despite diversity. Saint Mardarија writes that in church, quote, separate objectives and desires had disappeared, and they were at one in their attitude of reverence and peace. The choir raised a chant, and the congregation joined in, end quote. But to what extent did this unity go beyond the church walls, and why did it ultimately fail? This is still an open question. The Russian Orthodox Church recognized the challenges posed by urban life and the proliferation of new secular ideas. It therefore began publishing journals, pamphlets of the lives of the saints, diocesan newsletters, organizing temperance societies, choirs, processions, and pilgrimages, and building new churches in worker districts. As a quick aside, I remember this is a Greg Freeze, I believe, anecdote. He said that one of the problems with the temperance societies or the sobriety societies, there was usually the wives coming to sign up the men, the husbands, and it didn't work that way. The husband actually had to show up and sign up for the temperance society. The wife couldn't show up and sign up on his behalf, but apparently they used to happen kind of often. Okay. But the Russian Orthodox Church was aware of these problems, and the Russian Orthodox Church was far more socially involved during the late imperial period than Western observers realized, at least until recently. In Kishinev, Father Mardarија participated in the establishment of a philanthropic organization called A Drop of Milk, which provided relief to the children of poor families. Working mothers would drop off their children for the day and pick them up on the way home. Quote, children of Russians, Romanians, Bulgarians, and Jews were equally welcomed, end quote. Of course, while the church was active in the cities, the socialists and other revolutionaries were not sitting on their hands either. They were spreading their own literature, educating, and agitating. By 1917, a substantial part of urban Russia had clearly been radicalized, and this is something that the Saint Mardarија noticed and took note of in his memoirs. Okay. But what of the peasant? What of the Russian peasant? While a seminarian in Zhytomyr, Hieromonk Mardarија accepted an invitation to serve in a remote village. He did not like to decline invitations. On a bitter cold night, he rode on a sleigh through the countryside, quote, feeling chilly at the thought of that long, hard service in an icy church, end quote. Much to his surprise, the church was packed with a mass of worshipers who gathered long before his arrival. In his words, "They're coming here, many of them from villages and hamlets several miles away, for a humble prayer, in weather severe enough to freeze the blood in their veins, was a veritable act of piety. What an edifying example it would have been for those city folks who are so often negligent about attending divine services in spacious edifices provided with warmth and all comforts," end quote. St. Mardaria's memoir tests time and again to the religiosity of the common Russian people, namely the peasant, in Pachaev, in Kiev, on the outskirts of Moscow, and elsewhere. His testimonies of peasant religiosity are consistent with the findings of historian Leonid Heretz, who claims that the traditional Orthodox pre-secular worldview of the peasants survived largely intact, at least until World War I, if not longer. Heretz's research is an important corrective to scholarship that summarily dismisses Russian peasant religiosity. The flawed logic of those analyses, in Heretz's words, is as follows, quote, Russian peasants knew little of formal theology. They were devoted to ritual observance and often behaved in a less than saintly manner. Therefore, they were not Christian, or they did not take religion seriously, end quote. On the contrary, argues Heretz, Christianity, specifically Eastern Orthodox Christianity in its Russian redaction, was the source of almost all the basic categories and images of the traditional culture. The linchpins of the traditional peasant worldview were belief in the good Tsar as the father of the people, Batyushka Tsar, and of educated society. Interestingly enough, this is Heretz's argument, not mine, but educated society as agents of evil. Heretz's work provides rich context for understanding the cultural gulf that lay between the educated and the peasantry, and the failure of would-be reformers to transform the countryside according to their plans. Heretz also explains how during World War I, quote, the removal of millions of peasant men in the prime of life caused a great vacuum in the social, psychological order in the village. The patriarchal village order could not function without men. There arose a genuine concern for the well-being of the villages, and a protracted absence of the men led to great anxiety and alarm. So opposition to the war could be born of desire to sustain traditional village order. While pointing to the vitality of religious feeling in the capital and making reference to huge gatherings of workers when popular priests went to the factories to preach, Bishop Mardaria's memoirs acknowledge the lukewarm religiosity of urban dwellers relative to that of the peasants in the countryside. As for elite society in the capital, and I'm going to try to get oriented here. Yeah, I haven't gotten there yet, so we're going to have to keep looking at the peasant picture. So as for the elite society in the capital, St. Petersburg, Petrograd, St. Mardarija identified a dramatic upswing in religious fervor. Quote, never before in its history had religious enthusiasm reached such heights as it did during the years just preceding the war, end quote. The upper classes were involved in God-seeking. The religiosity of the people of the salons of the capital was of a different type. It was more philosophical, Western, and largely, as Mardarija points out, separated from the church. St. Mardarija reserves most criticism, though, for the clergy, and specifically the bulk of the episcopate, which, quote, very seldom descended from their thrones into the thick of everyday life, end quote, and avoided close association not only with the common folk, but also with the lower clergy. He divides the bishop into two groups. The first, substantially larger group, practiced what he called pompous isolation, whereas a smaller group created an active connection of mutual love and esteem. The latter group was absolutely adored by the people. Some of this unfortunate state of affairs was a result of the bureaucratization of the church, which is usually traced to the ecclesiastical reforms of Peter the Great, who chose not to call for the re-election of the patriarch following the passing of Patriarch Adrian in 1700, and eventually replaced the patriarch with the ecclesiastical collegium, then renamed the Holy Synod, with a secular procurator to look over it as the eye of the Tsar. During the late imperial period, the church came to see this position as abnormal and to press cautiously for reform. The culmination of this process was the local council of the Russian Orthodox Church in 1917-1918, which reestablished the Patriarchate. Mardarija addressed these problems with two notable hierarchs whom you see before you. Archbishop Tikhon, Archbishop at that time, Bilavin, the future Patriarch of Moscow, and Metropolitan Vladimir Bogayevlensky, who would become the first martyr of the Bolshevik terror in Kiev in 1918. Having attended two seminaries and a theological academy, the Theological Academy in St. Petersburg, Petrograd, and traveled widely during this time in Russia, the higher monk Mardarija believed that he had a good understanding of the Russian village priest, whom he came to know as a modest and sympathetic character. Yet he claimed that 75% of village clergy had revolutionary tendencies. Why was that happening? He believed that the genuinely lofty goals of the priesthood clashed with the harsh realities of village life. There was a bureaucratic resistance to change. Priests were isolated from their bishops and received no logistical support. Here I'm echoing the analysis of Mardarija. Their bishops, so isolated from the bishops and had no logistical support. Priests survived largely on voluntary donations from the peasants. As Mardarija writes, the priest, quote, was forced to hold out his palm to the relatives of the man he had just buried, grief-stricken as they were, and deprived perhaps of their chief source of income, end quote. These observations are consistent with the findings of Greg Fries in his work on the village clergy and corroborated by some other primary sources. St. Mardarija believed that the bishops could do something to change the state of affairs, but were not capable of concerted action, and failed to see that, quote, a general cannot wage a war without an army, end quote. Despite these problems, there were dramatic signs of religious renaissance. Okay. This, by the way, this is kind of the traditional kind of image, kind of not only Marxist, but kind of liberal image of the village and of the village priest. It brings to mind, I think this is not accidental, the Russian emigre iconographer, Archimandrit Kiprian Pezhov, has a card, a Pascha card, that is a transfiguration, if you will, of this image, where everyone's sober. The peasants are sober, the priest is sober, right? But I think he must have taken it from this. So this is kind of, Mardarija says really the village maybe wasn't that different from this depiction. Okay? There was, however, at the same time, a religious renaissance, particularly a renaissance of monasticism in the years before the war. Brenda Meehan Waters points out that the appeal of monasticism for women and the growth of female monasticism was actually even more dramatic than the growth of male monasticism. So the appeal of monasticism for women may have been in part owing to the blurring of class distinctions in the monasteries. Women of simple backgrounds found themselves on equal footing with their previously high-class counterparts. There are other cases where women would enter monasteries to escape abusive husbands and things along those lines as well. St. Mardarija provides us with some additional insight into the potential appeal of monastic life, which contrasted the fast-paced competitive environment of the modern cities and towns. And here I'm quoting directly again. The interrelationship of the monks and the Optina hermitage has always seemed to me a living realization of the ideals of brotherhood and equality that many reformers have thought could be made universal by political means. As to liberty, that too is found in monasteries. For the rule of the monastery is not enforced as laws are. It is consented to. And indeed, without the Christian attitude of love, forgiveness, of yielding to one another, it would have no meaning, even if it could by some other means be brought to pass, end quote. Whether Russia was in a state of religious renaissance or religious decline before the war is, oddly enough, not entirely clear. And as some of the other topics I've mentioned, can be a fruitful topic for debate and discussion. What is clear, however, is that Russia was divided. In his 1964 History of the Russian Revolution of 1905, Sidney Harkave wrote of two Russias: an official Russia of the gentry and nobility, and an unofficial Russia, village Russia, peasant Russia. Interestingly, St. Mardarија, through his memoir, uses the concept of two Russias as well. But he focuses more on pan-Slavic peasants, supportive of the fellow Slavs, the Serbs, and their Tsar, who came to the defense of Serbia at a time of Austrian aggression, and other proponents of military victory in World War I, versus Westernizers, Germanophiles, and traitors. You have the good guys, the ones who support the war, right? And you have the bad guys who are the ones who oppose the war, in some way undermining the war effort, which is being made by the Tsar on behalf of the Slavs collectively. While this framework can be helpful in analyzing late imperial Russia, it is overly simple in my analysis. You may disagree. In some regards, Russia was more integrated than the framework implies. As I mentioned, recent research has emphasized the unifying effects of Orthodox Christianity, which transcended class, connected people of different socioeconomic backgrounds, and so forth. On the other hand, Russia was highly divided by class, by worldview, and by a lack of mutual love and trust. There were indeed many Russias. The unity that was achieved inside the church walls, and again, Mardarија refers to this time and time again, the unity that was achieved inside the church walls did not have a sustained effect on life outside of the church walls. Okay. Pan-Slavism. Okay, so Pan-Slavism, the notion of the brotherhood of all Slavs, can be seen as part of an effort to unite these many Russias into one Russia during World War I. Okay, it was an attempt to get everyone behind the war effort. Pan-Slavism was an intellectual construct, but one with some religious components. And it sprang up in part as a response to the revolutionary sentiment, in part as a response to revolutionary sentiment and Germanophilia. It was a cause that Hieromonk Mardarија championed both before and during World War I, driven largely by his desire for the liberation of Serbs living under Austrian rule. Russian Pan-Slavism, the notion of Slavic brotherhood, first emerged in organized form in the wake of the Slavophile movement of the 1840s and 1850s. A Pan-Slavic conference was held in Prague in 1848, but without Russian participation. And then in 1867, a second Pan-Slavic conference was held in Moscow. Okay. According to some historians, the Russian state showed more interest in Pan-Slavism after the Crimean War. But that's not entirely true, because Russia had shown a degree of patronage, not only over other Slavs, but also over other Orthodox earlier. Just recently, I heard a lecture that talked about the humanitarian aid that was provided by various Russian societies during the Greek War of Independence. So this is not something that was new in terms of the identity of the Tsar. There definitely was this view of the Tsar as the patron, not only of the Slavs, but patron of the Orthodox who were under the foreign yoke, the yoke of foreign oppression, whether it be in Austria-Hungary or in the Ottoman Empire. Although we have to keep in mind that St. Mardarија wrote his memoir in 1934, based on his memory, he seems to have had a strong sense of Slavdom from his early years. He also clearly embraced the notion of Russia as the leaders of the Slavic world. He referred to Russia as, quote, potent protector of the Slavic race, end quote. After disembarking from the train on Russian soil in 1908 for the first time, he, in his words, threw himself, quote, flat on the ground and kissed Russia, the soil of Russia, end quote. Upon arriving in Moscow, he went on to the Serbian mission, where he immediately felt a union with the Russian people. Quote, "This was the first striking example I had seen of the spiritual union that exists among the various branches of Slavic Orthodoxy, of the power of linking us all together, that Old Church Slavonic, the language of our services, possesses." End quote. St. Mardaria's most memorable day in Moscow was January 14th, St. Sava's Day, when the whole of Slavic Moscow crowded inside the walls of the Serbian mission. While it would be tempting and easy to judge St. Mardaria's Pan-Slavism as a spin-off of some stereotypical, blind, misguided, maybe even exclusionary nationalism of the age, to do so would be presumptuous in my analysis and misleading. First, his Pan-Slavism should be seen within the broader context of Pan-Orthodoxy. At the start of the First Balkan War, the hieromonk delivered a fiery oration in Kazansky Sabor, Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg, proclaiming that, quote, "Slavdom now raises the flag of its eventual victory." And further, "May a cross of the Lord, set up on the dome of St. Sophia by a reverent Slavic hand, replace the crescent forcibly put there 5 centuries ago. And may they, the Slavs, perform their historical mission, the putting together once more of the broken and scattered tables of the law on which are inscribed the call to universal brotherhood, love, and liberty." End quote. In his memoir, St. Mardaria also testifies that during the First Balkan War, that is 1912-1913, quote, "several new societies sprang up in St. Petersburg. The Russian-Bulgarian, the Russian-Greek, and along with them, the Russian-Serbian Society," end quote. These societies collected large sums of money and sent currency and hospital supplies to the Balkan Christians. He himself founded a Russian-Montenegrin beneficent society because he didn't like that there wasn't one of those. So he put major effort into making sure that there was one of those societies as well. So Pan-Slavism was not exclusive of Pan-Orthodoxy, if you will. And Orthodoxy itself, as we probably know, was referred to as Greek Orthodoxy in the church, sometimes as the Greek Catholic, that is universal church. Second, we need to be careful not to lump together all, quote, nationalisms, right? It's kind of easy to say nationalism is nationalism is nationalism. Well, there are probably nationalisms of different types, I would say. In 1909, Metropolitan Antoni Khrapovitsky, with whom the young hieromonk Mardaria associated while in seminary in Zhytomyr, and whom he characterized as, quote, "a kind-hearted friend of the Serbs and ardent Slavophile and lover of the Serbians," made a clear distinction between Western nationalism and Russian Slavophile nationalism. In his analysis, Western nationalism, which was also embraced by Russian liberal parties through a parroting of Western trends, had as its motive self-preservation and domination of others, in which he, that is Metropolitan Antoni, sees nothing lofty, inspiring, or holy. He finds it arbitrary. Why not then unite around external physical traits, right? Like the color of your hair, okay? We're all redheads, let's beat up the blonde guys, right? He frowned upon that, right? He frowned upon that notion. Just because we're similar, just because we're the same ethnicity, we're gonna team up and expand our territory. That's not what he had in mind when he talked about Russian patriotism. In contrast, he found Russian patriotism not not an egotistical kind of nationalism, but as obedience or as service or as a mission of promoting the purity of Christ's faith. Quoting directly, Russian identity, the people's identity, is not racial, not tribal, but confessional, religious. End quote. He argues that Russians consider the apostles and the Mother of God their ancestors, not out of ignorance, but owing to a belief in the continuity of faith. To be Russian for them is synonymous with faithfulness. Metropolitan Antoni also cites the late 800s attack of the Rus, or Varangians, on Constantinople, the miraculous event celebrated on the church calendar on October 1st as the protection of the Most Holy Theotokos. when Russian ships were destroyed by a storm following the prayers of the Byzantine Greeks to the Mother of God. Quote, "It is clear that our people considers as its spiritual ancestors not the ancient Russian pagans, but the Greek Christians, and considers the Greeks' enemies, that is the Rus, their enemies." End quote. Metropolitan Antoni saw Russia's religious faithfulness as the source of its patriotism and its past successes, and also as its only real option in the future, the only option that would allow it to face challenges like moral corruption of children in the schools, and this is he was listing these things. This sounds kind of familiar maybe to us. Moral corruption of children in the schools, propaganda against the church and the state, and attacks on Christian marriage. Saint Mardarија saw Russians in a similar way, a very similar way. Comparing Russia to Germany, he wrote, quote, "Russia is a people not of conquerors, but of sacrificers." If that's a word, that's the word. He viewed Slavs collectively in a similar way. He saw them as having some unique positive qualities, such as meekness and mercy, as Dr. Groves mentioned in his talk, owing largely to the influence of the spirit of Christianity, which he believed had declined in the West. In conclusion, I'd like to tease out a single message from the preceding information. Okay, in 1917, many Russias won out, I claim, many Russias won out over one Russia. Okay. Saint Mardarija did not blame Tsar Nicholas II for Russia's fall, largely owing to the deep-seated flaws, problems, systemic problems that he inherited. His evaluation of Nicholas's character was decisively positive. Allow me to read directly from Saint Mardarija's memoir. Once, when co-officiating with the Archpriest Vasiliev at a service during the Lenten season, I had an opportunity to observe the Emperor receiving the Holy Sacraments after an extended fast. Standing as I did at the side of the altar, I was able to see the reverent face distinctly and to watch it from one end of the service to the other. And very few things in my life have had so much power to strengthen my religious faith. I can compare its effects on me only with the emotions aroused in my soul by the extreme piety of the Optina sages. All through the service, the Tsar's face showed strain, the strain of his preoccupation with his own thoughts, up to the moment when, exclaiming, quote, "In faith and in the fear of God, draw near," the priest comes forth through the central door of the iconostasis with the holy sacraments, at which point the Russian emperor, accompanied by his family, starts toward the priest while the others follow. In a steady voice, with every word sounding distinctly, the emperor repeated the words of the communion prayer. "I believe, O Lord, and profess that thou art truly the Christ, Son of the living God, and this is very flesh of thee, and this is very blood of thee." Then bowing profoundly low, making the sign of the cross several times, and then crossing his arms on his breast, he received the Holy Communion with the utmost reverence. Then he crossed himself once more and kissed the holy vessel, and I noticed that as he bowed once more and stepped back, a change had come over his face. The worried look had vanished, and in its place had appeared the most joyous radiance. Not only while I was still in Petrograd, but all through the years that I have spent in America, that radiant image of the Russian emperor as a sincere and uplifted believer has kept coming back to me as I saw him at that Lenten service in Tsarskoye Selo. And no amount of slander or evil insinuation has been able to destroy or darken that image for me. I regard such views as attributable only to an application of the Jesuit principle, the end justifies the means, on the part of their perpetrators. Believing as firmly as I do in the moral purity of the Emperor Nicholas II, I have always considered and still continued to consider him an innocent victim, a prisoner enclosed in an iron ring of intrigue, surrounded on all sides by those who had set out to betray him, his dynasty, Russia, and the Slavic cause. Those who themselves felt no loyalty toward Russia or Slavdom naturally could not honor an emperor who had burning love for both. And in their conviction, Nicholas II would only be, borrowing the lines of Lermontov, characterless, immoral, vain, mean, selfish, weak in will. End quote. I'll stop there. I could keep going. It's a rich quote, but I'll stop there. So he didn't place the blame for the fall of Russia at the feet of Nicholas II, not at all. Okay. This tragedy, the tragedy of 1917, I think, based on my analysis, had something to do with a crisis of leadership. Okay, and perhaps in the formal kind of way that has something to do with one or another action of the Tsar and things along those lines. Okay, but that's not what Mardarија focuses on. Okay, he noted a certain lukewarmness and kind of even paralysis in Russian society. He bemoaned the passivity of very intelligent and deeply believing men in educated society, and that of the episcopate. A common retort to his concerns, to both groups, deeply believing, kind of educated men and bishops, was "Ничего," which can roughly be translated as, "It's all right," or "It'll be all right." Okay? This "it's all right," this "ничего," continued through the tragedy of 1917, when things clearly were not all right. There were exceptions to this passivity. A vivid one was the confessor of the royal family, Father Alexander Vasiliev. This man of peasant stock was so genuine and heartfelt in his prayer that workers flocked to him. Quote, "He found time every Saturday and Sunday, as well as on holidays, to visit the slums of Petrograd, the factories and laboring class districts, and to preach the gospel in them." Father Alexander managed to bring together the many Russias. Okay, here's a direct quote again from the memoir. "For years, Father Alexander's church was filled exclusively with laborers. But when his fame spread, which after time it did like a torrent, beyond the streets of the slums, the aristocracy began to come and hear him. On the floor, dusty or muddy from the feet of hundreds of laborers, baronesses, countesses, and even princesses and princes knelt. And here they not only crossed themselves, but wiped tears from their eyes after doing so." End quote. Okay? He united the many Russias. Perhaps it is prophetic that we are all here on the 100th anniversary of the tragic events of 1917, reflecting upon those events and venerating the memory of a saint who did not fall prey to the climate of those times, to cynicism, to passivity, to hate, who held himself to a high standard in fulfilling his vocation and duty. Only imagine if in 1917 there were not one Father Alexander Vasiliev, whom I just mentioned, but 100 or 1,000. What if there were 100 or 1,000 hieromonk Mardarias? Would the revolution have happened? Could many Russias have become one Russia? Would Russia have disintegrated? I'll let you answer the question, but I think there's a lesson in it for us. God is merciful. Through his providence, he sanctified Russia with the blood of martyrs. God, as we know, steers history in such a way as to give us another chance. At the time Hieronk Mardarija was at seminary in Kishinev, the local archbishop was Serafim Chichagov, a colonel who had left the army to become a priest. Quote, "He not only extended me the hand of friendship, but gave me a room and board in his ancient archiepiscopal palace. He became a second father to me." End quote. Archbishop Serafim, eventually metropolitan, and then hieromartyr Serafim, died in Butova, a killing field about an hour's drive from Moscow, during the height of Stalin's purges in mid-1937. After the purges of the 1930s, the Russian Orthodox Church as an institution was almost completely destroyed. As an institution, almost completely destroyed. The goal was to destroy it. And it was almost achieved on the eve of World War II. And then, through tragedy, the the tragedy of World War II, came gradual rebirth. Writing during the dark days of Stalin's rule, before there was any palpable sign of rebirth, Saint Mardarija wrote of Russia's coming revival. Quote, "The evil years will pass, and the light of Christ will dawn upon the Russian land. My firm conviction is that the Russian people, through its suffering, is on its way to the world's arena with the greatest message of regeneration of humanity," end quote. Saint Mardarija recounts the legend of the liturgy at Hagia Sophia, interrupted by the Ottoman sack of the city in 1453, and how the priests, together with the Holy Mysteries, miraculously found haven in the walls of the church, from which they will emerge to complete the liturgy when Constantinople is liberated. Quote, "Just so with the faith of the Russian people," he writes, "it lies safely behind the walls of their hearts, ready to come forth with its brightness undimmed when these times shall have passed. Nor do I believe that we shall have to wait 6 centuries for this to happen. And the Russian revival will be part of something larger. Out of these times is perhaps destined to come some great religious revival involving the whole world. But this, of course, depends on all of us. Budi, budi, so be it, so be it, so be this revival." Yep.